The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists, to AP Economics, presented by Cobranomics, your all-American history teacher, gold standard of economics, le champion of classical liberalism, and your sensei of supply side, Professor G here, and today we are going to take a look at Unit 4, Lesson 6, the return to long-run equilibrium without any government or central bank efforts. Now, remember, John Maynard Keynes is not writing to replace Adam Smith. Adam Smith speaks of the invisible hand, that if the government leaves everything alone, laissez-faire, the economy in the pure circular flow model will function fine and work at its own, and as Jean-Baptiste Say says, will work at its own hills and valleys, its own highs and lows. However, John Maynard Keynes also says, in the long run, we are all dead. Although he's more referring to monetary policy and the equation of exchange rate we'll get to, it is apropos that the government should not let the situation, as we saw before, sort itself out. And Keynes warns that if you leave things to business, you cannot trust the animal spirit of business. To fix specifically a recession, Keynes is writing during the Great Depression, the government needs to step in, push the economy in the right direction, and then will remove itself, but doing so with fiscal deficit spending. However, Keynes acknowledges that what Jean-Baptiste Say stated, that the economy can, if left alone, fix itself, is true. However, the problem with that is that the price level versus input costs are different. The price level in the short run is much more flexible, and input costs in the short run are sticky. But, so they don't change as fast, and this is why, when you're in a recession with the price level low, businesses are not going to start producing more because it's difficult for them to. There's no profit. And investment spending is not going to happen out of anywhere, because if you just came from where we should be, then investment spending has already happened. We already have the factories, we already have the machinery, but the people aren't working from some other exogenous shock. This is why, as we previously saw in the past few lessons, that Keynes recommends using fiscal policy to manipulate that initial injection of government spending to increase consumer disposable income for that multiplied effect as that spending goes around and around and around the circular flow model. However, Keynes does recognize that either from recession or from inflation, if the government did nothing, there is a process for which the economy will go back to normal through long-term pressure on input costs, long-term pressure on short-run aggregate supply. So here we are in a recession, and remember with an AP test, sometimes it will say draw starting at equilibrium into an exogenous shock, or sometimes it will say the exogenous shock already happened, draw where we are. So we're going to start from we are already in a recession, and now we're going to take a look at two things. First recession, and then inflation. We're going to take a look at what happens over the long term. And when you see that on the AP test, that is the context clue for, hey, describe the process of the long-term input cost pressures on short-run aggregate supply for how the economy returns to normal on its own. So without any government or central bank action, these are the long-term pressures on input costs. So long-run aggregate supply remains the same. It always remains the same unless there is some long-term change to the quality or quantity of resources or technology. But short-run aggregate supply can face long-term input costs pressures. And there are two methods which you can explain it. I like method 2 the best. It seems the most linear, even though method 1 is shorter. So, the first method, price level is decreasing during a recession. This causes businesses to expect the price level to keep decreasing. If businesses expect the price level to keep decreasing, businesses will see that, well, in the future, that means profit's going to be even worse, so they need to start producing more now. And short-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. So that's method number 1. Price level is going down. Businesses expect it to keep going down and are worried about, well, in the future, if price level keeps going down, there's going to be no profits in the future. They may as well produce more now, so they will autonomously produce more now. Short aggregate supply will shift to the right. Returning the economy to equilibrium without any government or central bank involvement. But again, for Keynes, so why this is true, that this could happen, in this case, Keynes is worried about two things. One, how long does this process take place? And two, that in a recession, when profit margins are already down, when it's really survival of the fittest, how do you trust the animal spirit of business just to automatically start production? It's too unpredictable, this method. So while true, too unpredictable for Keynes. That's why he recommends stepping in with the fiscal policy. Method number 2, this is also from recession back to long-run equilibrium, back to LRAS, Space Mountain, standing tall right there. Method 2, the recession, like I said, I like this method best because I feel it really just speaks to the pressure on input costs and is the most linear. Method 2, a recession increases unemployment. Unemployment is the main problem during a recession. As the recession deepens, unemployment increases. As unemployment increases, this leads people willing to work for less. Right? Things are getting worse. People are willing to accept a lower nominal wage. As people are willing to accept a lower nominal wage, this puts a downward pressure on nominal wages. As nominal wages decrease, input costs will decrease. Wages are input costs. As input costs decrease, this shifts aggregate supply to the right. Once again, the economy is back to where it should be. And here for the problem with Keynes, Keynes says, yes, this is true. However, in these input costs, wages are sticky. We don't know when wages are going to go down, and especially as wages become more institutionalized, not necessarily a bad thing, but just the economic reality, the stickier and slower changing they become. But in the long run, either method 1 or method 2 will put pressure on expectations of prices or pressure on input costs, and without the government or Federal Reserve doing anything, shift SRAS to the right back to long-run equilibrium. And be careful how the AP test asks you this question. It might say what happens to SRAS. It might try to trick you and say what happens to LRAS, in which case nothing happens. It remains our goal. And then explain the process. Alright, now we're going to take a look at what happens from inflation if the government does not do a contractionary fiscal policy, or the Federal Reserve does not do a contractionary monetary policy. What happens from inflation? How do pressures on SRAS shift it back to LRAS? Let's take a look at that next.